Hi everybody, this is Dr. Chris Dost. Welcome back to my YouTube channel, Biblical Languages and Literature. Before we get to today's video, I just want to share with you a few really exciting courses that are being offered through Sabra Global Education in the upcoming weeks and months. The first one, going from the top left, is Jesus' Parables as Jewish Scripture, taught by Dr. Stephen Notley of Alliance University. Below that, we see the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, an introduction taught by Rabbi Dr. Robert Harris. And in this course, we're going to look at the quote-unquote original meaning of various Hebrew Bible Old Testament texts, and then consider how Jews and Christians have interpreted them over the millennia. To the right of that, you see the Dead Sea Scrolls in the New Testament, which is going to be taught by Dr. Jeffrey Garcia of Alliance University. And then finally, yours truly will be teaching the basics of Biblical Hebrew, which is going to be a 4-week class in the fundamentals of Biblical Hebrew and electronic tools for Bible study. Please be sure to check out these courses on Sabra Global Education's website, and I hope to see you in class. All right, let's get started with the video.
Tongue in cheek, I say, I don't really care when Isaiah was written, how many Isaiahs there were. It doesn't really matter to me. What matters to me is that by the first century of the Common Era, it's one book, and they're reading it, and they're applying it to it's a whole part of Midrash. They're interpreting it because they think that they believe it to be relevant to how they live out their lives in a very complex world. I think sometimes Christians do not appreciate the complications of the world in which Jesus lived. He lived in a time of military occupation, injustice, hopes for redemption that didn't seem to be anytime soon. People were asking the question, how do we realize God's redemption, which of course in Jewish terms also meant liberation. It has a political aspect to it as well. And people were asking those difficult questions. My understanding of, my approach to this is that I think there's a sea change that happens in the 2nd century BCE. The events that lead to the Hasmonean revolt, the Antiochian persecutions, religious persecution, which is really not a very common thing. You were not persecuted for religious differences in the ancient world. That's a bit of historians struggle trying to understand what was motivating Antiochus IV in doing his sort of crackdown upon the Jews, limiting them in terms of their religious practice, and the events that lead to the revolt and the persecutions that happen. And I think if we listen carefully to the voices that are speaking in that time, which involves reading intertestamental literature, which I think is very, very important. I always encourage my students to read it because you're listening to. It's like reading somebody's email. You're reading what's going on. What are people concerned about? What issues that they're addressing? Because their issues aren't necessarily our issues. And the challenge for us is to climb into their skin and try to hear things as they hear them, see them as they see them. And we hear about the events that are going on that speak to, they cannot understand what they've done to justify such suffering. For instance, you have a book, the Testament of Moses, where you have a figure named Tax, when he cries out and he says, who else has ever, suffered such things that we're suffering? And we don't deserve it. And I think that's a voice of that period of time where in the Hebrew Bible, the general idea is that God blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked. Now you do have Job, so you have struggling with the Odyssey and where is God when bad things happen to good people and that kind of thing. But this is a different question. This is where is God when bad things happen to good people? But when bad things happen to people because they determined to stay good. They refuse. They refuse to transgress. Here they're suffering not just out of happenstance. We're not talking about a hurricane or a tornado or a car wreck or something of that nature. We're actually talking about people who are suffering because they refuse to transgress the commandments. And that actually is a more acute problem. And I think out of that situation, you have it's the epicenter, in my humble view, it's the epicenter of sort of Second Temple period Jewish thought. From there, I think almost every major theme or idea that develops in that intertestamental period comes out of that. You think of the idea of resurrection. Resurrection is a seminal idea, certainly in the Hebrew Bible, but it's not a dominant idea. But out of this period of time, suddenly resurrection, as Nicholsburg has written, really takes on a prominence, specifically to address, the righteous whose lives are cut short, and the wicked who live long lives. So how do you rectify that? You have resurrection and judgment in the afterlife, so that can all be dealt with, and that you have a number of issues that are that come out of that period of time. One of them, I think, is quite significant, is the issue of Jewish humanism, a humanistic approach, which Flusser has written on it extensively, quite a bit, and I think it's very important in terms of understanding Jesus's ethics, his teaching. It lies at he's right in the middle of that conversation of how do we relate to each other, and taking the humane approach. How do we view each other? I mean, every day I hear people talking. Last week I was at a religious place, and it had a display and was talking about how we're all creating God's image. And I turned to my wife and said, "There it is again." I said, "This is fiction. The idea that Genesis is intended to say that we are all creating God's image." They in many circles in the Second Temple period, they read that as it's written, Adam, make Adam in our own image. And we don't have after you have Genesis 1 and Genesis 9, where it's repeated, we don't have that concept repeated again in the Hebrew Bible. The idea, the universal idea that we're all created in God's image, is not an idea that is championed in the Hebrew Bible, but it does come out of these series of events. The first time we hear of sort of the corporate, general, universal idea is Ben Sira. And it grows out of, it's in a response to this, these set of events that I think becomes, I don't want to describe it as a crisis of faith, but it certainly is the genesis for of distinctive Jewish ideas that continue. The trajectory continues into Rabbinic Judaism. They become part and parcel with the Rabbinic approach, and I think that Jesus is in the center of that. He echoes those ideas. There are a number of occasions where we hear that reflected in his teaching. And I think he's, in a sense, indebted, if you want to use that language, or at least a part of that conversation. I would say, without those developments in the first century, setting the stage, Jesus could not have said some of the things he said. He's very much part of those developments. And again, some Christians get uncomfortable with that statement, but I just tell them, you have to understand what you mean when you say in the fullness of time. When you say fullness of time, that means that it's in the first century, the Common Era, and not the 5th century BCE. There are things going on that are part of that whole development. I mean, I'm speaking here as a Christian, of course, but that I have no problem with seeing those things in process. So we have a number of sort of ideas, doctrines, notions that develop out of that, that I think work their way into the New Testament and the Gospels, particularly, is my area of interest.
When you think of Jesus as a Second Temple Jew, is there one passage in the New Testament that comes to mind that epitomizes Jesus as a Second Temple Jew? Or is it something in terms of his teaching, the content of his teaching, how he teaches? What comes to your mind?
There's a number that you could pick from, but and of course, I'm interested very much in the parables, and the parables are a really flourish within the, I'd say, the Second Temple period, are the classic early Jewish parables. The parable as a genre continues, but as we move into the second century, it begins to sort of disintegrate. It increases in number and decreases in quality. That's not just my assessment. That'd be the assessment of Jewish scholars who work in parable studies. But his parables are right in the center of that. There are things that he's doing with the parables that's very much reflective of the ideas that are going on. I think there are ideas that he pushes the envelope, but he pushes the envelope in the sense that he's building off of those who've come just prior to him, like his idea of loving your enemy, the person who hates you. That's not repeated by anyone. Even Paul, no one does that. But that's Jesus taking that whole development of Jewish humanism one more step, and which Flusser he did say to me, he said, it's breathtaking that he was bold enough to take that step, that not only do you love those who are outside of your community, outside of your circle, but you even love those who hate you. And that is a he could not have gotten there without the undergirding of development of ideas within Second Temple period Judaism. So I mean, I see that as him being very much, both parables, some of his thinking, his ethic, his other things are, other things. The question reminds me of a conversation I heard once between Shmuel Sofrai and David Flusser, and Sofrai was a great Talmudic historian, and I was sitting one day listening to the conversation, and Shmuel Sofrai said, everything Jesus says can be found in the Talmud. There's nothing, everything he's saying you can find in the Talmud, somewhere in the Talmud. To which Flusser responded, yes, but no one puts it together quite like Jesus. And that's the two parts of this, is that you find him saying things that others are saying, but like any creative scholar, reformer, he's taking things and he's knitting them together, putting them together, crafting his own message, his own statements in very distinctive ways. And I think that's the challenge for us, is to hear where others are echoing his statement and are, but also being sensitive to those areas where Jesus is pushing that envelope and trying to speak in very distinctive, unique ways in his setting. So,
I've heard you refer a few times now to some Second Temple documents, Second Temple Jewish literature. Can you talk to us a little bit about the value of Apocrypha and Pseudopigrapha for the study of the New Testament?
Sure. Again, it's usually with my students who are coming out of a confessional community, so they deep faith. I always start with the incarnation. I say you've got to enter into aspects of culture that if you will, our belief that God works in culture. And so that culture of the New Testament is not ours. As much as I might like to think of Jesus identifying with me, he's not an American. He's not he doesn't he's not limited to my particular culture. So it's the challenge is on me is to climb inside and to understand what were the issues in that period of time. To as I said earlier, the analogy to read their email to see what they're discussing. What are the particular issues? And again, I teach in an evangelical environment where they're not very sympathetic to the Apocrypha, and they refer to them as Catholic books. These are not Catholic books. These are Jewish works, and they oftentimes reflect the 400 silent years, as some refer to them as. They weren't silent. We just are ignorant of them. That's what it is. And so it's important for us to read that literature, to the Apocrypha, the Pseudopigrapha, pseudopigraphical writings, and they're collected in these days, which makes it much more helpful for us and accessible. They've been translated, and so they're in English. And so you can read them and try to get a sense as to what were the cultural issues of the day, what were the red button issues, what were the expectations people had, what were the hopes that people had, and the question then I step and say, how does Jesus reflect that? Does he reflect those ideas? I think for myself, I started thinking this way early on because my doctoral dissertation was on the Holy Spirit in Second Temple period Jewish thought and early Christianity. And so what I did, for me, it was a discipline that I repeat again and again and again. And that is taking either a subject, a word, how a passage is interpreted, or a particular passage in the Hebrew Bible, and tracking it, following it, and seeing how it is dealt with in the different pieces of literature or the different communities in the Second Temple period. And once I had a good sense as to how that was developing along or what people were thinking, then saying, okay, now with fresh eyes, I want to go back and read the New Testament to see where it falls on the landscape of Jewish thought. Is it agree here, or more than one place, different authors reflecting different positions on that landscape? And like for myself, I found that there's really nothing, I couldn't find anything, especially in the early portions of let's say, the Gospels and Acts. I could find nothing that was un-Jewish. There's everything I could find within Jewish writings in the period. And so, which was for me a surprise, a pleasant surprise, because I realized that this stuff has come out of a very distinctive religious culture. But it also helped me to read the New Testament text in a different way, because once my eyes had been trained, or my ears had been trained to sort of hear things within a different religious cultural setting, then it made me go back and try to read the New Testament with that same sensitivity. And what I found oftentimes is that I had been misreading. I was trying to force upon it a culture that didn't belong on it. And again, I think that's a challenge for all of us, is to climb inside of a text and to try to listen how it's being written, what the intent of the writers.